In the last video, S4E86, I put up the chart that you can see on the right side reading in Luke Acts, but I didn't get a chance to talk about it. So I'm adding this little postscript to the last video to go over a little bit more of the context of what reading would mean in the story you see on the left side of the screen when Jesus challenges a lawyer by asking him, "What do you read?" And as I noted last video, there, the word there is not there in the Greek. So, and literally, the important thing is how do you read, the Greek word pos here. So we're going to explore a little bit of what is behind the question, how do you read, and what reading meant biblically and in the Greco-Roman Empire at the time for Luke's audience. So on the right side of the screen, of course, you can see we're reading aganiosko in Greek is used in Luke Acts. The previous time we saw was where Jesus stood up to read from the scroll of Isaiah, from Isaiah 61 as we know it. Earlier in chapter 6, we saw Jesus challenge the Pharisees in a similar way he challenges the lawyer now. Have you not read what David did from 1 Samuel? Then in Acts of the Apostles, we see a couple of important scenes that really describe how reading became important for the early ecclesiae, to say the churches of the Greco-Roman world in the time after Jesus. So in Acts of the Apostles, we see the story of the Ethiopian eunuch who was in his chariot reading the prophet Isaiah. So actually, we see someone here actually engaging in the process of reading. And the Holy Spirit says to Philip to join him, and they have a conversation about what they're reading. Notice it doesn't necessarily say that Philip knows how to read, but he understands the scriptures. That doesn't mean that he's actually physically read it, but that he has it in him. Just like so many people in oral tradition, oral culture, would know their own stories of themselves, their personal lives, of course, as we all do, and of their culture and their nationality, if they identify with the nation, without actually having the physical skill of reading printed words or written words. So this is a case where the Ethiopian eunuch does it, and it should not be surprising in setting of what we're going to talk about here, that he's a high-level person. An Ethiopian eunuch would be somebody who's working for the queen, the Kandake in Ethiopia, and so this would be a high-level person, perhaps parallel to a scribe in the Bible. Then Paul refers down here in speaking to a synagogue in Antioch, generally to the words of the prophets that are read every Sabbath. And that, of course, echoes what we heard in Luke 4 of Jesus reading from Isaiah on the Sabbath. And we see the same thing from James here in chapter 15, the so-called Council of Jerusalem, when they decide what to do about Gentiles. And again, the similar thing, Moses has been read aloud. And that's the key, they're read aloud, so one person reads and everybody else listens, much like happens in a synagogue or most churches these days, where somebody reads and everyone else listens. But here we see a response where people actually read from a letter, and that's a very unusual thing. Again, here we see official people, the letter from Claudius Lysias to the governor Felix being read. But in the time of Paul, as many scholars have noted, Paul's letters would not be read by the congregation. They're basically like a screenplay, like a performance script, that the messenger who would be chosen, not only because that person had the technical ability to read the printed words or the written words, but also to play the part of the character. So when Paul is sending a message to the churches in various places, someone would be Paul in the first person as a performer in addition to a reader. So that was an important part of it because the overwhelming majority of people could not read. And that calls us to go back a little bit historically to understand where reading came from and what it has to do with the Bible. Because certainly nowadays we think of the Bible as primarily a book like any other book, in the sense that it's made in with hard covers or paper covers and printed in a normal way in a script that we recognize, not in handwritten on a scroll or in Hebrew or in Greek. So it looks like a regular book to us. We have to recognize how utterly foreign that was in the ancient world, where scrolls were the form of writing until roughly the time of Luke's gospel, when the codex became the new technology for writing and rapidly took over. A codex is much like what you might think of if you had a 3-ring binder as a kid or otherwise, where individual pages are bound together, not with glue and thread like in a hardcover book, but loosely, which meant they could be taken out individually and rearranged if necessary, which is a pretty handy thing if you're editing or writing. So the codex was beginning to take over, but we see presented are almost always scrolls, which, if you go back to my video from Luke 4, involved the technical act of being able to read it physically, not just to be able to know what the letters meant, but to be able to physically pick it up and unroll it without ripping it. And of course, in Hebrew, I shouldn't say of course because you might not know, but Hebrew writing meant only consonants, and there's no lower uppercase, there's no punctuation, there's no spaces, and no vowels. So the art of reading was really a technical skill, much more than reading English with all our punctuation and other typographical paraphernalia like exclamation marks and quote marks and the things you can see on the screen on either side. So with that change, writing began to be more available, but that's after the period we're talking about. So we really need to think about scrolls and recognize that very few people could read. Reading was a function of the king, not that the king could read necessarily. That's why the kings had scribes. But the king used writing to proclaim the royal power, and often that meant in public writing, like monuments and inscriptions on things. And of course, the Roman Empire had enormous number of those that tell us a lot about the Roman Empire. But the Roman Empire had lots and lots of documents. And in a place as far flung as the Roman Empire, especially when travel took as long as it did, sending letters was often the only way for the emperor or someone else in Rome to let people out in the provinces know what they were to do or what was going on. And it was a very slow process. So having someone to read was very important so you could understand what the instructions were. But in addition to the practical aspects of it, reading meant putting something in a semi-permanent form to show how serious it was. So obviously to inscribe the king's words on stone, many of which we still have thousands of years later from the Babylonian or Assyrian or other ancient empires, show us just how permanent those were supposed to be. Obviously on perishable materials like scrolls or even clay, it's another story. The royal documents almost always meant something inscribed that people could see to express the permanence. And that's, of course, expressed in the image of Moses going up to the mountain to get 2 stone tablets of the law. But that's so much for writing. But what about reading? And I want to walk us through just a few passages from the Hebrew Scriptures so you can hear what the attitudes of this lawyer might be in this conversation with Jesus about reading. So the oldest in the sense of the one earliest in the biblical stories from Exodus 24, after Moses has gone up to get the tablets and engaged in a covenant ritual to get the people to participate in this, we hear this passage. Moses took half of the blood, which is from the bull he sacrificed, and put it in basins, and half of the blood he dashed against the altar. Then he took the book of the covenant and read it in the hearing of the people, and they said, all that Yahweh has spoken we will do, and we will be obedient. And so that's the earliest one where it's Moses directly reading that to the people. And it may well be that the character Moses could read. Exodus shows him being raised in the Egyptian court, and that may have exposed him to the technologies of reading. How he can read Hebrew is another question if he was raised in the Egyptian court, but the story doesn't worry about that. Then we have another one from Moses, but we have to pay attention to the fact that the one I'm about to share from Deuteronomy is tightly connected both to the one that follows in Joshua, which is also Moses, but also to the one in Nehemiah, where it's the priest Ezra speaking there. So just to say something about that context. By almost all scholarly accounts, at least the early form of Deuteronomy is the same text that's referred to in 2 Kings 22, when a scroll of the law is supposedly found in a hidden place in the temple and is discovered and then is read aloud. But almost all scholars say that's a little fiction there, that this text was written there for the purpose of justifying Josiah's reform in the 7th century. Which is to say, his attempt to consolidate worship in Jerusalem and to get the former Israelites to come into Jerusalem in the face of the Assyrians. And so the Deuteronomy and the Joshua passages are almost certainly from that time period, trying to justify Josiah's reform. So the first passage we'll listen to is part of the so-called Law of the King that goes from Deuteronomy 17:14 to 20. And we'll just listen to these couple of verses from chapter 17, 18, and 19. When he has taken the throne of his kingdom, he shall have a copy of this law, which is to say Deuteronomy, which literally means second law, written for him in the presence of the Levitical priests. Notice the Levitical priests as one group, in contrast to what we see in the story in Luke, where there are priests and Levites as separate people. It shall remain with him, and he shall read it all the days of his life, so that he may learn to fear Yahweh his God, diligently observing all the words of this law and these statutes. So that suggests that the king can literally read it, keep it like by his bedstand. Whether the king could read or not, again, is another question. There's no reason to think that just because someone was a warrior or otherwise a member of the elite that made him a king, that he could read. Reading was really a specialized skill. But in addition to that from Deuteronomy, we hear this from Joshua 8 in the voice of Moses, but imagine this coming from the time of Josiah in the 7th century BCE. And afterward he, which is to say the priest Ezra, read all the words of the law, blessings and curses. Notice the language of blessing and curses echoing from Deuteronomy 30. According to all that is written in the book of the law. There was not a word of all that Moses commanded that Joshua reading here, did not read before all the assembly of Israel and the women and the little ones and the aliens who resided among them. So notice the outsiders, described here as aliens in the New Revised Standard. It could also be foreigners or sojourners. All are hearing this word read aloud by Joshua. And of course, that sets up the precedent that we'll see in the book of Nehemiah. And one reason the book of Nehemiah is important, in addition to what it tells us about reading, is the book of Nehemiah, along with its companion book Ezra, is one of the texts that establishes the hostility between Judeans in Jerusalem and Samaritans, who wanted to be part of the temple rebuilding, but were rejected by the purity code established by Ezra that said anybody who had been married to quote-unquote foreign women could not be part of the rebuilding and part of the new community in the post-exilic Jerusalem. And so the excluding of Samaritans was a key part of that. And the book of Deuteronomy, which is very much about excluding foreigners, in fact, about killing foreigners, as opposed to those who reside among them, who've become part of Israel one way or another, either as slaves or as fellow travelers in a sense. But all the foreign nations, as we saw in texts like Deuteronomy 7, the Israelites are commanded to destroy. And so we hear this in Nehemiah 8. All the people gathered together into the square before the water gate. They told the scribe Ezra to bring the book of the law of Moses, which Yahweh had given to Israel. Accordingly, the priest Ezra brought the law before the assembly, both men and women, and all who could hear with understanding. This was on the first day of the 7th month. He read from it facing the square before the water gate from early morning until midday, in the presence of the men and the women and those who could understand, and the ears of all the people were attentive to the book of the law. Notice the contrast between the Nehemiah passage and what I just read from Joshua. Nehemiah does not have "and the aliens who resided with him." It has the men and the women, but only those who could understand, whatever exactly that means. Does that mean understand like they speak Hebrew, or does it mean they understand the meaning of it? Because presumably all these people are speaking and understanding Hebrew itself. So it must imply those who could understand what's being said there. And that establishes as quote unquote scriptural from the book of Deuteronomy that they just invented the reform that Josiah had to get rid of any priests who didn't worship in Jerusalem and to exclude anybody who was married to a foreign woman and their children as well. So that's the precedent. And what that leads to, the only other writing element we need to pay attention to is one of the elements of the exiles. Not everybody went to Jerusalem. A lot of the former Jerusalemites settled in Egypt and it had a community there in a number of places. But Alexandria certainly became a center after Alexander and Hellenism began to spread over the area. And that leads to the so-called letter of Aristias to Philocrates, which is a letter, and you can see just a little piece of the text of it itself along with this printed version here, that was written to explain the origin of the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. And the project itself was very controversial because many people believed that Hebrew was God's language and that to translate this in another language would make it no longer sacred. Many Muslims feel the same way about the Quran, that it should only be in Arabic and not be translated. And there are many arguments for that, not just on the grounds of what God speaks, so to speak, but on aesthetic and other grounds, and that the Hebrew can't really be translated because there are word plays and other things that only work in Hebrew. But since so few people spoke Hebrew, they had the task of translating into Greek, and they had to justify why they could do that. And I won't go into all the background of that, but this letter tries to justify why 70 rabbis agreed completely on the translation, and therefore why the Septuagint should also be included as a sacred text, even if it was in Greek. And that remained controversial, but certainly the Septuagint is what Luke's working with throughout. So what would this imply for Luke's audience? Certainly not likely to be pious Jews, but to be obedient young Greco-Romans being formed in paideia, the educational process that not only gave them skills like reading and writing, but taught them the propaganda that Rome gave them to support the empire in their roles among the elite. The Roman Empire was certainly an empire of documents, and there are just countless documents. That's one reason we know so much about the Roman Empire, is as they left enormous troves of documents around. So for Luke's audience, reading would have been well understood as an essential skill for preserving culture and preserving order, both for having texts from the past, and as I've mentioned in other contexts, especially around the book of Revelation, the Roman Empire was very conservative in the direct sense of that, of trying to conserve things in the understanding that things tend to deteriorate and fall apart over time. Human bodies, obviously, but also societies. So the best way to preserve a society was to be conservative, to hold on to the things that you knew worked, or at least you believed worked, for as long as possible. And so Paideia had a form that maintained the same reading list, so to speak, for hundreds of years, much like until the second half and later half of the 20th and now 21st century, reading in American universities, at least, and certainly in English universities, had what we call the classics, which meant, interestingly, Greco-Roman texts, as well, of course, as other texts, almost always by white men, which led to a rebellion against that with the women's movement and other movements we've seen since, widening, of course, the scope of reading, and that's highly controversial in the year that I'm making this video. But certainly we know in a society where reading is almost universal, that when something is written, we can use it and show it to somebody else. And we have so much reading that we don't even notice it, especially on the internet. So we have to really contrast that although Luke's audience would have been familiar with text and had a relative lot of text compared to the Israelites, nothing compared to what we have here. Because writing was expensive. A written document meant you had to hire an expert, and you had to have the papyrus or parchment or whatever it was. Parchment came from sheep, and papyrus from the reeds in Egypt, or whatever other form of perishable material that wasn't just ready. You had to lay it out and pound it and make it into that material that we call something like paper or a scroll. So it was very expensive, and a long scroll or a codex later would have been like the equivalent of having a diamond ring or a necklace, a sign of prestige that only the most wealthy would have had. So when we hear about these passages about what do you read or how do you read, we don't necessarily expect that he's got a copy in his pocket like somebody might carrying a Bible around, but that he has it in his mind, and the question is the interpretation. But by using the verb here for reading, it's highlighting that this is a member of the elite. And curiously, Jesus, as the son of a carpenter, probably, historical Jesus, probably not literate, and so the text that we have in Luke 4, where it says he stood up to read, probably means he memorized it as it was given to him orally, and just holding the Torah scroll up there to highlight that it wasn't just his words, but the words of Isaiah preserved in the sacred form of a scroll. So as we return to our story in the next video, number 87, we'll pay attention to hopefully what you heard here about what reading would mean for Jesus and for the lawyer and for Luke's audience. See you next time for that. Bye-bye.